Hello, and welcome back to my channel, Crime Whispers. I know many of you enjoy these stories as you drift off to sleep. So before you close your eyes tonight, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe now. Get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into tonight's case story. 1. I've never heard of anything quite as horrific as the Kapunda triple murder. It's a case with no equal. These were just good people, living ordinary lives, and yet, someone shattered all of that in the most brutal way imaginable. Every time a murder shocks the world, we ask the same question. Why? And this case leaves us haunted even more in the normally peaceful town of Kapunda, a place where crime was almost unheard of. Something truly unspeakable happened. Even the toughest investigators described this case as one of the most savage, blood-soaked crimes a jury had ever encountered. It was so brutal that when the killer was finally caught, the grieving family had only one message: I hope he goes to hell. I don't care what happens to him. So, what could have happened to it provoke such a fierce response? And should this be a case where the death penalty might be considered? I'll leave that for you to decide by the end of this video. But first, let's get to know the victims. Back in the fall of 2010, in the small, tranquil town of Kapunda, South Australia, population just 3,000. Life moved slowly near the peaceful Light River in the Barassa Valley. Here lived the Rowe family. Andrew Rowe, the family patriarch, was born in England in 1965 when he was just 3. His family moved to Australia and settled in a quiet Adelaide suburb. Andrew grew up known for his friendly nature, great sense of humor, and love of fishing with his dad. He was the kind of guy anyone would want as a neighbor, always smiling and ready to lend a hand. As he grew older, Andrew met Rose, a cheerful and vibrant young woman, just a year younger. They met while Andrew was studying in Adelaide, and sparks flew quickly. In 1985, they married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by close family and friends. 2 years later, in 1987, Andrew and Rose welcomed their first child, a son named Christopher. 7 years after that, in 1994, their family was complete with the arrival of their daughter, Chantel. Life in Kapunda felt perfect. Andrew and Rose started a carpet cleaning business that thrived, giving their family financial security. By the summer of 2010, Christopher was 23 and living nearby with his girlfriend, while 16-year-old Chantal worked part-time as a waitress at a local roadside cafe, balancing school and work. But life wasn't without its struggles. Chantal discovered she was pregnant, a challenge for someone so young. With her boyfriend Dylan by her side, she faced the future, determined to give her baby the best life possible despite the difficulties. She had unwavering support from Dylan and friends who stood ready to help. The Rowe family's life was filled with love, hope, and the usual ups and downs, until the night of November 7th, 2010. The night that shattered everything. At midnight, an intruder broke into the Rowe family home and committed a murder so savage it shocked even Adelaide's most experienced detectives. The house was a scene from a horror film. Blood splattered across floors, walls, curtains, even the ceiling. But no one noticed anything was wrong for 2 days. Neighbors, worried by the lack of movement, peeked inside and discovered the horrific truth. Andrew, 45, and Rose, 44, were found in the kitchen, horribly disfigured. Chantal's body was in her bedroom, torn apart. Each victim had suffered multiple stab wounds and had been dead for days before police arrived. At the time, Christopher was away on vacation with his fiancée in Queensland when he heard news of dead bodies found on his family's street. Panic set in. He rushed to Facebook, desperately searching for answers and confirmation of the terrible news. What made the situation even worse was that Christopher couldn't reach his family at first. He was told the victims weren't his parents, but soon the police confirmed his worst fears. They broke the heartbreaking news to him over the phone. When the autopsy results came back, they only deepened Christopher's anguish. The number of stab wounds was staggering, a total of around 112. Andrew, his father, had been stabbed 29 times. His mother, Rose, over 50 times. And Chantal 33 times. The most horrific detail was that Chantal had been sexually assaulted before her life was so brutally taken, leaving Christopher devastated beyond words. Strangely enough, Christopher was initially the prime suspect, simply because he was the only surviving family member. However, investigators quickly ruled him out since he was the first to raise the alarm after being unable to contact his family. His alibi was verified, and fingerprint checks confirmed he was on the opposite side of the continent when the murders took place. So then, who could be twisted enough to kill 3 innocent adults in such a savage way? The Rose were well liked in their town and had no known enemies who would want to harm them. The community, especially Chantal's friends, desperately sought answers. Why would anyone attack a pregnant teenager with such cruelty? Adding to the horror, investigators uncovered a chilling detail. After the murders, the killer calmly changed into clean clothes and laid down on Chantal's bed. Bloody drag marks near the bed showed that Chantal had desperately tried to hide, but the killer had pulled her out, refusing to let her escape. Nothing had been stolen from the house. Phones, a laptop, an expensive camera, and cash were all left untouched in plain sight. Ruling out robbery as a motive, the extreme brutality suggested either more than one perpetrator or a physically strong individual capable of overpowering 3 adults. Investigators noticed that the suspect had clumsily attempted to clean the crime scene, wiping away footprints in some areas before giving up. Bloody shoe prints led to the door but suddenly stopped, indicating the killer may have removed their shoes and left in socks to avoid leaving further evidence. Even more disturbing was the lack of forced entry, meaning the family likely knew the killer and let him inside willingly, or he had another way to enter. As previously mentioned, forensic experts confirmed Chantal had been sexually assaulted before she died, making the crime even more twisted and deeply personal. The most gut-wrenching revelation involved Rose, the mother. She had been stabbed over 50 times, far more than Andrew or Chantal. Despite the initial attack, she had survived long enough to call for help, but before assistance could arrive, the killer returned and stabbed her repeatedly until she could no longer resist. With no known enemies or personal conflicts involving the parents, the police began focusing their investigation on 16-year-old Chantal and her boyfriend, Dylan. The young couple had been together for a year, were still in school, and expecting a baby. At first glance, Dylan didn't seem capable of such violence, but investigators had to be thorough. They questioned Dylan, verified his alibi, and asked if he knew anyone who might have wanted to harm Chantal or her family. Heartbroken and cooperative, Dylan shared stories about his loving relationship with Chantal, including their plans to marry someday. He was devastated by her death and struggling to comprehend the tragedy. At the time of the murders, Dylan was attending his grandfather's anniversary in a nearby city. His alibi was solid, backed by dozens of witnesses, officially clearing him as a suspect, despite few solid leads. The police held one major advantage: the killer's DNA and fingerprints. Seminal fluid found on Chantal's body provided a crucial piece of evidence, but when run through databases, there was no match, meaning the murderer had no prior criminal record. Another chilling detail was that the knives used came from the family's own kitchen, suggesting the attack was likely unplanned, an impulsive outburst of extreme violence. To complicate matters, the killer took the murder weapons with him, leaving almost no physical evidence behind. Forensic experts estimated the time of death to be between midnight and 2 a.m. A neighbor later came forward, recalling that around 1 a.m. they had heard Rose scream for help twice, followed by a loud thud. Tragically, they assumed it was just a domestic dispute and didn't alert the authorities. No strangers were reported near the house that night, and officers meticulously searched the area for any clues or the missing weapons, but came up empty-handed. Hoping for a breakthrough, police appealed to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward. Calls flooded in, but most proved to be false leads, wild theories, or outright hoaxes. Adding to the frustration of the investigation, then Dylan shared a detail that sent chills down investigators' spines on the Sunday night before the murders. Chantal hadn't been feeling well. She had developed a fever and even called her boss to say she wouldn't make it to work the following morning. At exactly 5 a.m., Dylan sent her a text to check in. The message was marked as read, but there was no response. What Dylan didn't know was that by then, Chantal and her parents were already dead, and the person who had read his message wasn't Chantal at all. It was the killer. Even more disturbingly, police discovered that the murderer had tried to reply to Dylan's text, but Chantal's phone was out of credit. This was a failed attempt to fake her being alive. With this eerie revelation, detectives dug deeper into Chantal's social circle, searching for anyone who might hold a grudge. That's when they came across Jason Alexander Downey, a 17-year-old who was close with Dylan but barely knew Chantal. At first, Jason didn't seem threatening. Average height, thin, and seemingly harmless. Police planned only a brief questioning, but as the interview went on, his behavior grew odd. Instead of answering directly, he became increasingly nervous. Raising suspicions, he complained about not being invited to Chantal's party, and pointed out how everyone else had a partner. Though this had no relevance to the case then, out of nowhere, he volunteered an alibi for the night of the murders, a detail no one had asked for. This erratic behavior deepened the officers' doubts, prompting them to take his fingerprints and DNA. Surprisingly, Jason remained calm and cooperative, which briefly made the police question their suspicions. But the truth came to light when experts examined his fingerprints and noticed fresh, deep cuts on his palms. Though Jason claimed these were from a machine shop accident, the wounds appeared to clean and precise, like they'd been inflicted by something sharp. Then came the smoking gun. Fingerprints found on Chantal's bedroom door matched Jason's within 2 days. DNA results confirmed the worst. Jason Downey was the killer, contrary to the initial assumption that the murderer had to be big and strong to overpower 3 adults. Jason was thin and unassuming, a chilling reminder never to judge a book by its cover. He had even fooled many people close to him when family and friends gathered to mourn. Jason was seen on local news laying flowers at the site, playing the part of a grieving friend perfectly born in Killarney, Scotland. Jason had moved to Kapunda with his mother and older brother Jaime. On the surface, his background seemed normal enough, but beneath it all was a dark side that only he and Chantal truly knew. Chantal had always been polite to Jason, but their relationship was distant. She neither liked nor disliked him, merely tolerated him as part of the group. But Jason didn't handle rejection well. After multiple rebuffs, his feelings twisted into something darker and dangerous when he learned Chantal was pregnant with Dylan's baby. Something snapped inside him. The thought of his friend, Dylan, being the father, not him, ignited a jealousy-fueled rage that culminated on the night of November 7. Thought there was a darker twist. Jason's anger wasn't just toward Dylan. His jealousy and obsession with Chantal had reached a boiling point. That night marked the beginning of a tragic end. When police first questioned Jason after his arrest, his calm demeanor shocked them. He denied everything with unsettling ease, trying to talk his way out of the mounting evidence. He claimed his fingerprints at the Rowe family home were from a visit a month and a half earlier, a slip-up that would later unravel as police dug deeper. They found that his DNA was also on. Jason tried to dismiss the evidence by concocting a bizarre story that during that same earlier visit, he and Chantal had been intimate, but his lies quickly unraveled. Forensic experts confirmed that the DNA found on Chantal's body couldn't have remained there that long. It was simply impossible. That falsehood became just another nail in his coffin. Jason's confession revealed a disturbing chain of events that painted a chilling picture of that night. After a heated argument with his mother and stepfather, Jason decided to sleep in his car, but then he learned from Dylan that Chantal was homesick, and his obsession spiraled to a terrifying new level. What started as a plan to simply drive by and glance at her house turned into something far more. Sinister Jason parked his car at the end of the street, out of sight, then walked toward the Rowe family home. The house was dark, all the windows closed, except one bathroom window, left slightly ajar. Being thin and agile, Jason slipped right through without hesitation. Once inside, he quietly sat in the bathroom for about 30 minutes, listening and waiting for the house to settle. Ensuring everyone was asleep, Jason claimed his original plan was to confess his feelings to Chantel. But realistically, why would he grab a kitchen knife before entering her room? Investigators immediately knew this wasn't just an awkward confession. Jason had far darker intentions. Believe he intended to threaten her, to control her in the twisted way his obsession demanded. When he finally entered Chantel's room, she resisted his advances, and that's when everything snapped. Her rejection triggered a violent fury inside him. In that moment, Jason unleashed a brutal stabbing frenzy. Over and over again, Chantal's screams woke her parents, Andrew and Rose, who rushed to protect her. But Jason, consumed by rage, turned on them as well, stabbing both to death in a frenzied attack. In his confession, Jason claimed he acted out of uncontrollable passion, yet the cold, calculated nature of his actions told a very different story, one of premeditation, not a spontaneous outburst. The investigation progressed. Even more damning evidence emerged. A pair of blood-stained shoes was found discarded in a remote area. The blood matched all 3 victims, and the shoe prints matched those found at the crime scene inside the shoes. Traces of Jason's sweat were also detected, tightening the case against him. Despite promising to reveal where he had disposed of the knives, the murder weapons were never recovered, leading detectives to suspect Jason was still trying to manipulate the situation. Even as evidence piled up, Jason Downey's trial finally began in the fall of 2011. Nearly a year after the murders, throughout the proceedings, he remained cold and emotionless, frequently changing his testimony and showing no remorse. He continued to claim he had no memory of killing the Rowe family, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. One chilling detail revealed at trial was that after the massacre, Jason took Chantel's pendant and chain, a personal item he kept even after her death. During the trial, Jason even argued the tragedy could have been avoided if Chantel had simply invited him to the party she hosted before her death. It was clear that his deep feelings of rejection and obsession had driven him to commit this horrific act. Throughout the trial, Jason maintained a calm, indifferent demeanor. When he finally pleaded guilty, it was seen as a strategic move to secure a lighter sentence. He later admitted to his brother that this was his attempt to avoid life imprisonment without parole. Those close to the family described Jason's lack of remorse as chilling. Police, who investigated the savage crime and his detached attitude, agreed the guilty plea was no sign of true repentance for a crime so cruel and brutal. In April 19, 2012, Jason Downey was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Had he not pleaded guilty, he would have faced at least 45 years before parole eligibility. Jason even wrote a letter addressed to Chantel's family and friends, expressing sorrow and stating he deserved whatever punishment came his way. Yet, when examined closely, the letter seemed more like a forced apology, words written because he had to, not because he truly felt remorse. Chantel's brother, Christopher Rowe, who tragically lost his entire family that night, expressed that while he believed justice had been served, no punishment could ever heal the immense pain of his loss. To honor their memory, Christopher had their names tattooed on his body, a permanent tribute to the family he had lost. In one interview, he couldn't even bring himself to speak directly to the press, so he let his cousin speak on his behalf. After the tragedy, Christopher took 6 months off work and left Kapunda, retreating from the world. When he eventually returned, he struggled to find interest in his work. Over time, he took over his father's carpet cleaning business, renaming it from First Choice Carpet Cleaning to Rose Choice Carpet Cleaning. Way to honor his family's legacy while rebuilding his own life. As for Jason, he remains incarcerated at the Moreland Juvenile Detention Center in South Australia, serving his sentence. Story 2. January 1980. A family of 4 returned home, after a day filled with special moments, but for this family, tomorrow would never come. Teresa Gilligan, a devoted wife and mother of 2, spent her final moments not screaming or pleading, but comforting her terrified children in front of their cold-blooded killer within minutes. The entire family would endure an unimaginable horror, one so brutal it defies comprehension. What's especially frustrating about this case is that the killer became more well-known than the innocent family he destroyed. That simply doesn't sit right today. We're diving deep not to glorify the crime, but to bring the victims back into the story where they belong. Though justice was eventually served, it would take 25 years before the remaining family could finally find peace. Once you hear the full story, you'll understand why. For this case, let's travel to Evansville, Indiana, where the Gilligan family had built their lives in the late 70s. By all accounts, they were the definition of a loving, all-American family. Patrick, the father, and Teresa, the mother, were both 30 years old in 1980. Together, they were raising their 2 young children, Lisa 5, and Gregory 4, in what seemed like a simple, happy life. There isn't much information about them online, but what we do know is that Patrick worked as a warehouse manager at LBJ Jones Furniture Company, providing a steady income that kept the family comfortable. Teresa dedicated herself to making their house a warm, safe, and loving home. She made sure Lisa and Gregory had everything they needed, from bedtime stories to home-cooked meals, creating the kind of childhood every child deserves. Back then, Evansville was a growing city of roughly 130,000 residents. It was an industrial hub, with factories and manufacturing jobs driving the local economy. Most neighborhoods had that close-knit, small-town feel where neighbors knew one another. Kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and families came together for community events. The Gilligans were no different. They were active in their church, well-liked by neighbors, and had a reputation for being kind, hard-working, and devoted to family. Teresa was involved in her community as well, having chaired meetings for the Indiana Association of Legal Secretaries, and even led an astrology-themed talk called The Age of Aquarius. Patrick, on the other hand, had been a star athlete in his youth, even setting a discus record at Wake Forest, before settling into a stable career in Evansville. But beyond their community roles, what really stood out about the Gilligans was how well they raised their children. Lisa and Gregory were always neat, polite, and well-behaved, traits noticed and praised by teachers, neighbors, and family alike. Unlike some picture-perfect families that hide turmoil behind closed doors, the Gilligans were exactly who they appeared to be, genuinely happy. There were no rumors of affairs, no marital fights, no dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. In fact, just 2 days before the unthinkable happened, Teresa told her mother how incredibly lucky she and Patrick were. In her own words, she said, "There are so few people who ever find the kind of love we had, and just like so many true crime stories, tragedy struck when the family least expected it." It was January 14th, 1980, and Patrick had the day off from work. Days off were special for the Gilligans. They usually planned something fun for the whole family, and that day was no different. Lisa and Gregory had recently received Christmas money, so Patrick and Teresa took them out to spend it on whatever they wanted. It was one of those simple yet cherished moments, a regular family outing, where parents let their kids pick out toys or treats, little things that would bring a smile after finishing their shopping. They stopped by the children's grandparents' house for a quick visit before heading home. It was around 8 p.m. when they pulled into their driveway. Their house sat in a house was located in a quiet suburban neighborhood on Aspen Drive, the kind of place where doors were rarely locked. Crime was almost unheard of, and safety was something everyone took for granted that night. Teresa and her children were the first to step inside, while Patrick stayed behind in the garage. What they didn't realize was that a man armed with a gun was already waiting for them, before Teresa could even fully grasp what was happening. The intruder aimed his weapon at her and ordered her to stay silent. Her heart must have been pounding, but with her 2 young children right there, She had no choice but to comply. The stranger forced them to sit down, his gun a chilling reminder that he was in control, using whatever he could find around the house, including a vacuum cleaner cord. He bound Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory tightly just as he finished. Patrick walked through the door for a brief moment. He might have been confused, perhaps thinking it was a prank or a misunderstanding, but when he saw his wife and children bound and terrified, and a man holding a gun standing before them, reality hit hard like any devoted husband and father. Patrick tried to reason with the intruder, hoping to calm the situation and protect his family, but the man was not interested in negotiation. He forced Patrick to the ground at gunpoint and tied him up alongside Teresa and the children in a twisted attempt to keep them calm, more maybe just toying with their fear. The intruder assured them that he wouldn't hurt anyone, that this was just a robbery, and that once he got what he wanted, he'd be gone. But as the case later revealed, that was never the plan. The killer admitted that he hadn't intended to kill the Gilligan family at first. However, when Patrick spotted an opportunity to fight back, everything changed as the intruder rummaged through the house, searching for valuables. Patrick managed to loosen his restraints, fueled by desperation to protect his family. He lunged at the attacker, hoping to overpower him, but the attempt failed now. The intruder had what he believed was a reason to eliminate the entire family in a split second. He pulled the trigger and shot Patrick, though severely wounded. Patrick didn't die immediately, still fighting for his life. He struggled to hold on the intruder, unwilling to take any chances. Grabbed a dumbbell nearby and mercilessly struck Patrick repeatedly until he was certain Patrick wouldn't get back up. Imagine the unimaginable horror Teresa and her children must have felt witnessing their husband and father being beaten too. Death right before their eyes. The children were likely terrified beyond words, clinging to their mother, desperately seeking protection. Yet, despite witnessing such horror, Teresa remained as composed as she could, likely doing her best to shield her children emotionally, if not physically. But none of it mattered. The intruder had already made his decision, whether out of fear of being caught or driven by something far darker. He was determined to leave no witnesses behind. In cold blood, he raised his gun again and, one by one, shot Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory, silencing the Gilligan family forever. As it turns out, the Gilligan home wasn't the only target that night. Later that evening, around 10:15 p.m., a concerned neighbor named Ralph Hendricks called after discovering his own house had been burglarized. Indiana State Trooper Thomas Snyder was dispatched to Aspen Drive to investigate. Following protocol, Snyder checked with nearby residents to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. He approached the Gilligan residence, right next door to Hendricks's home, and knocked on the front door. Receiving no responses, Xing another burglary, Snyder walked around to the back of the house, where he immediately noticed a taped and broken window on the door, likely an attempt to muffle the sound of forced entry. His instincts told him something was seriously wrong. Deciding to conduct a welfare check, Snyder entered the house, and what he initially thought was a burglary turned into a horrifying discovery. A gruesome quadruple homicide. Investigators arrived on scene and quickly saw that what began as a burglary had escalated into a devastating tragedy. Teresa's purse sat abandoned on a chair, its contents rummaged through, a clear sign the intruder was searching for valuables nearby. A shattered gun case lay on the floor, its glass broken, with all firearms inside stolen. What stood out most, however, was the state of the entire house. Was in complete disarray, every room turned upside down, given that a neighbor's home had also been burglarized that night. It became clear the crime spree had spiraled into a nightmare for this quiet community. Naturally, the neighborhood was gripped with fear. Crimes of this magnitude simply didn't happen here. Crimes like this simply didn't happen here, and the idea that someone could commit such brutal acts right in their own backyard was terrifying. In response, people began locking their doors, watching their streets more closely, and whispering in hushed tones about the tragedy. Then, the investigators caught a break. A neighbor remembered seeing a suspicious vehicle lingering near the area the day before the murders. an old, dented, light blue four-door Plymouth, in poor condition, in a well-kept neighborhood, where unfamiliar cars stood out immediately. This vehicle was noticeably out of place. Police quickly reached out to nearby law enforcement agencies to check for any reports of burglaries involving taped windows, a key detail from the Gilligan case almost immediately. Two names surfaced, repeatedly: Richard Milligan and Donald Wallace Jr. Both men were well-known criminals with extensive records, habitual drug users who often broke into homes to fund their addictions. Their criminal past made them prime suspects. As detectives dug deeper, they found out Richard Milligan owned a blue Plymouth exact car the neighbor had seen near the crime scene. Determined to find him, police set up surveillance at his last known address, hoping to spot the vehicle. Later, the Plymouth pulled up, but the driver wasn't Richard or Donald. It was a woman named Debbie Durham. She explained that Richard had lent her the car when police searched the vehicle. They found a gun and various stolen items reported missing from the Hendricks home. This discovery immediately connected Debbie on by extension. Richard too. At least one burglary. Debbie was arrested and taken in for questioning about Richard's whereabouts, while police didn't fully believe she was involved in the murders. They couldn't rule her out either. At the very least, she was their strongest link to Richard Milligan under interrogation. Debbie insisted she had no part in the Gilligan murders. She even claimed Richard couldn't have been involved because he was already in jail at the time of the killings. This revelation shifted the investigation entirely, leaving Donald Wallace, Jr., as the main suspect. Donald wasn't your average criminal recently released from prison. He was Debbie Durham's boyfriend and had a reputation that set him apart with an IQ of 130. Donald was intelligent and manipulative, often using his smarts to benefit himself. But despite his intelligence, his life was riddled with instability, crime, and deep-seated resentment. His troubled upbringing shaped who he became. Born to teenage parents who divorced when he was 5. Donald described his childhood as loveless and insecure after his mother left him in the care of his disinterested father. His life spiraled downward by age 11. He was living at the Evansville Psychiatric Children's Center, the first of many institutions he would cycle through over the next decade. By 14, Donald was already deeply involved in crime, bouncing in and out of juvenile detention there. He learned that violence earned respect, a lesson he carried into adulthood before the Gilligan murders. His criminal activity mostly consisted of petty burglaries to support his drug addiction initially. Debbie was unwilling to share much about Donald, but when police showed her crime scene photos, her shock overcame disbelief, and she began to speak. She had no idea where he was, but recalled the last time she saw him was the previous night when he stopped by her mother's house. Following this lead, investigators questioned Debbie's mother, who confirmed that between 7 o'clock and 9 p.m., Donald arrived in a blue car, acting erratically, with a jacket draped over his shoulder inside. He laid out an array of items for Debbie to see. Several guns, including a .38 caliber, matching the one used in the murder, stacks of money, jewelry, a camera, and other valuables. These items were later linked to burglaries at both the Hendricks and Gilligan homes. Shockingly, Donald even had Debbie's brother take photos of him posing with the stolen loot. Seemingly eager to flaunt his crimes, Donald didn't stop there. Debbie's sister recalled that, after his impromptu photo session, Donald went outside and started a fire. When the family stepped out to investigate, they saw him burning several items, including the very jacket he had worn earlier. A neighbor reported seeing a man with shoulder-length hair standing by the fire, acting on this. An officer searched the area and found remnants of the burned jacket. Beneath the charred fabric lay something even more incriminating: a set of wedding rings with missing stones and several shards of glass, further linking Donald Wallace Jr. to the violent crime spree. Debbie also turned over several of Donald's belongings: a pair of jeans, a ring, and a glove. The jeans matched those he had worn on the night of the Gilligan murders, and forensic analysis revealed traces of type AB human blood on the fabric. This was crucial evidence, since Donald's blood type was O, while Teresa Gilligan, and one of her children had type AB blood. The ring Debbie handed over was another key piece, though. Donald claimed it was purchased from a jeweler. Teresa's mother immediately identified it as Teresa Gilligan's. Further confirmation came from the jeweler, who kept detailed records and photographs of every piece his shop resized, proving beyond doubt that the ring belonged to Teresa. Glove was also tested and found stained with type B blood, the same as Patrick Gilligan. With this overwhelming evidence, it became clear that Donald Wallace Jr. was responsible for the brutal killings. A massive manhunt ensued, with Donald's name and face plastered across the news for an entire day. Police searched tirelessly. Then, on January 15th, a tip came in that he had been spotted in Newburgh, Indiana, hiding out with friends, but by the time officers arrived, Donald had vanished. His friends confirmed he'd been there but left, supposedly to check on Debbie, as he was aware he was wanted and wanted to know if she had been arrested. Beyond that, no one knew his whereabouts, and fear grew, given his violent history and the severity of the crimes. Everyone recognized just how dangerous Donald Wallace Jr. was. After a long day chasing false leads, the police were preparing to leave the station that evening when the phone rang again. This time, it was Bob Ashworth, a local coach who had been out walking his dog. He reported seeing a suspicious figure climbing into the attic of a nearby house, though skeptical, given the many misleading tips. Something in Bob's voice convinced officers to investigate. Upon arrival, they met Bob, who pointed out the house. They knocked, and an elderly woman answered, surprised but listening as they explained the situation. She insisted she had been home all day, and no one had entered her attic, but allowed them to check. Calling out into the attic yielded no response, as the officers cautiously climbed the stairs. One chambered his shotgun. The sound echoed through the attic, and suddenly a voice called out from the darkness, "Don't shoot, I'm coming down." A man emerged slowly, hands raised. When asked his name, he hesitated, then said, "Richard Milligan," but the officers knew better. The man was Donald Wallace Jr. Without hesitation, they arrested him on the spot. Donald later admitted that had he known he'd been recognized, the encounter might have ended very differently. At just 22 years old, Donald Wallace Jr. was charged with 4 counts of murder before his trial. He was declared incompetent and spent 2 years in a mental hospital in May 1980. 2 psychiatrists testified that he suffered from acute paranoid schizophrenia. However, in 1982, during a competency hearing, witnesses and evidence suggested he had been feigning his illness all along. His trial proceeded, but Donald never admitted to the murders. He claimed he had only been there to rob the house, and that an unknown accomplice was responsible for the killings. No one believed him, despite maintaining this weak defense throughout the trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. On October 21, 1982, Donald Wallace Jr. was sentenced to death, though publicly maintaining his innocence. Donald confessed in private, in a letter to Teresa Gilligan's sister. He described gathering random household items when he suddenly heard the garage door open. Panicked and trapped with no way out, he grabbed his gun, and Donald took control of the situation, holding the family at gunpoint and tying them up. Then, in a sudden and terrifying moment, Patrick Gilligan managed to break free. Donald immediately shot him after that. In his own words, "The killings happened so quickly he barely knew what was happening." He said that after killing Patrick, he realized he couldn't leave any witnesses behind, so he turned the gun on Teresa, and in what might be the most heartbreaking part of his confession, he admitted he couldn't bear the thought of the children living with the trauma of losing their parents, so he took their lives as well. In the years leading up to his execution, Donald fought relentlessly to delay the inevitable. He filed every possible appeal, went on hunger strikes, and searched for every legal loophole he could find, but eventually, he accepted that he was out of options. Just days before his execution, he publicly admitted to the murders, something he had avoided for more than 20 years. In a series of letters, he expressed remorse, claiming he was no longer the deranged addict he once was, that at the time he had no moral compass and no true understanding of what he'd done. He wanted the world to know he was sorry, and that if he could take it back, he would, but he knew it was impossible. Donald's lawyer had planned to submit a 48-page clemency request in a last-ditch effort to save his life, but in his final days, Donald refused to file it, waiving his right to seek mercy from the governor. "I'm ready to die," he said after 23 years of fighting. He had made peace with his fate. "The dying part is easy," he added. "I'm so tired of doing time." On March 9, 2005, at Indiana State Prison, Donald Wallace Jr. had his last meal: steak, baked potato, soup, and chocolate truffle cake. He declined a spiritual advisor and spent his final hours visiting with a few loved ones before being moved to a holding cell at exactly 12:23 a.m. He was executed by lethal injection. His final words were simple: "I hope everyone can find peace with this." That same day, Teresa's sister, Diana Harrington, held a vigil not for Donald, but for the victims. She had spent years ensuring the memory of her sister, brother-in-law, and their children would never be overshadowed by the man who took their lives, continuing that mission. In 2007, she and her husband Ted published a book titled Surviving the Death Penalty, a deeply personal account of the crime and its lasting impact on their family over the years. Donald Wallace became infamous not only for the brutal nature of his crime but also for the drawn-out legal battle that followed. But if he hadn't stolen the lives of the Gilligan family, they would still be here today, living the futures they deserved. Teresa and Patrick would likely be proud grandparents. Now, watching their children raise families of their own, their kids would have grown into adults, creating lives filled with love, memories, and milestones. Instead, their story was tragically cut short, and while Donald Wallace is no longer alive, his execution could never erase the pain left behind, the grief of those who loved the family, and the lasting scars from such a senseless crime. Now, I want to hear your thoughts. George initially thought the missed calls might mean Marie or Teresa had stepped out briefly, or the phone was misplaced. But when his brother-in-law arrived at the house, he was faced with a sight that would haunt him for decades: the bodies of Marie Aladar, her mother Teresa, and her two baby daughters, Samantha and Sabrina, were discovered under circumstances so horrific that those who saw the scene have never forgotten it. The home that once echoed with warmth, laughter, and the innocent sounds of children was now transformed into a place of unspeakable horror. The pressing question was, who could have committed such a brutal act? The Alador family had no known enemies. They were widely regarded as kind, loving, and peaceful, with no involvement in conflicts or criminal activities. So why were they targeted in such a merciless way? To understand, we need to know more about Marie Aladar, the woman at the center of this family. Marie Carmel Alador was a woman of quiet strength, resilience, and grace, originally from Haiti. She had grown up with big dreams of a better life. Like many immigrants, she faced challenges, adjusting to a new country, but refused to let obstacles break her spirit. Determined to create a brighter future, she eventually settled in the welcoming warmth of South Florida. Faith played a significant role in Marie's life. After moving to Florida, she began attending the Haitian Evangelical Baptist Church in Miami. It was there she met George L., who shared her Haitian heritage and commitment to faith and education. George had previously been married and had a son from that marriage, which ended in divorce in September 1991. Not long after, George and Marie met and fell in love. By February 1994, they were married, and later that year, welcomed their first daughter, Samantha. In the summer of 1995, the Aladar family moved to a 4-bedroom home with a pool in a quiet neighborhood in Florida. They were building a comfortable life together. Marie worked as a secretary for the Dade County School Board's information office and helped produce a morning radio program in Creole. George worked as a plant manager for Aqua Air Products, a marine air conditioning company, a position he had held for over a decade. He had also earned his real estate license and worked part-time as an agent. Those who knew the Aladors described them as a quiet church-going family deeply involved with their congregation. Sundays were reserved for church services, often followed by gatherings with friends and family. Their faith provided them strength, purpose, and a strong sense of community. By early 1997, the family was growing again. Marie was pregnant with their second child and gave birth to their youngest daughter, Sabrina, in March. With a newborn and a toddler at home, Marie's mother, Teresa, still living in Haiti, made plans to fly to Florida to support her daughter during this demanding time and to attend Sabrina's christening scheduled for the first week of May. Any mother knows how invaluable an extra pair of hands can be during those early weeks with a newborn. In the morning of April 30th, 1997, everything seemed normal at the Alador home. Teresa had arrived from Haiti, and the family was settling into their routine. George left for work at exactly 7 a.m. As usual, inside the house, Marie, Teresa, and the children were likely going about their day like any other. George had a habit of calling home during the day to check on Marie, and the children. That day was no different. He called around 2 p.m., but no one answered, thinking it was no big deal. He tried again at 3 p.m., still no response. This was unusual. Marie was on maternity leave and typically home during those hours, and if she had stepped out, Teresa would have been there to answer the phone. The persistent silence grew worrisome. Concerned, George reached out to his brother-in-law, asking him to check on Marie, Teresa, and the children without hesitation. His brother-in-law grabbed his son and headed over to the house. George's brother-in-law headed to the Alador home to check on the family. Arriving around 5 p.m., they knocked and called out for some time, but there was no response. Growing concerned, his brother-in-law tried the door, and to his shock, it wasn't locked. With his young son by his side, they cautiously stepped inside. The first thing that caught their attention was a bassinet placed in front of the TV. At first glance, it didn't seem unusual, but as they got closer, their hearts sank. Inside lay baby Sabrina, completely motionless and covered in blood. The sight alone was horrifying, but what followed was even worse. Just a few feet away in the kitchen, Teresa was sprawled on the floor, in a pool of her own blood. Overcome with shock and panic, the brother grabbed his son and fled the house, shouting for help. Neighbors quickly called 911, and the emergency call came in at exactly 5:42 p.m., reporting the grim discovery. When officers arrived minutes later, they had no idea the horror awaiting them inside. Baby Sabrina was still in her bassinet in the living room, her body showing clear signs of repeated blunt force trauma. Nearby in the kitchen lay Teresa, who had been shot in the head and beaten to death. But the devastation didn't end there. As officers continued searching the home, they found 2 more bodies. Marie was discovered face down in a pool of blood in the dining room, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, stab wounds, and severe head trauma. The final victim, 2-year-old Samantha, was found wedged between the couch and a chair in the living room. Unlike the others, her position suggested she had tried to hide, but it hadn't saved her from a fatal beating. The brutality of the murders left investigators stunned and searching for answers. As they combed through the house, it became apparent that robbery was not the motive. Furniture remained undisturbed, electronics were untouched, and valuable jewelry lay exactly where it had been left. Strangely, no murder weapon was found at the scene. Even more puzzling was the lack of forced entry. Doors were unlocked, nothing was broken, and there were no signs of a struggle near the entrance. This suggested the killer was someone the family knew and trusted, someone who didn't need to break in outside. Officers found the family dog in the gated yard. Reports described the dog as friendly and unlikely to bark or attack. Even at strangers, this raised a chilling question. Was the killer an unnoticed outsider, or was it someone much closer, someone belonging to the family? While searching one of the rooms, detectives discovered a message scrawled on the wall in messy handwriting. "I want my $100,000 drug money. They stole my drugs at first." This appeared to point toward a drug deal gone wrong or violent retaliation. However, thorough searches of the home uncovered no trace of drugs, no hidden stashes, paraphernalia, or anything else additionally. Neither Marie nor George had any known connections to drug activity. This left investigators with a series of troubling questions. This was truly about drug money. Why was the jewelry left untouched? Why didn't the killers search George's office where the supposed money might have been hidden? And most disturbingly, why would someone brutally beat a 6-week-old baby to death? The logic simply didn't add up. Detectives soon realized that the note was a smokescreen, a desperate attempt to mislead the investigation. With no signs of forced entry and no clear motive suggesting an outsider, they were forced to consider a darker possibility. The killer was someone inside the home. In cases like this, when an entire family is slaughtered so savagely, the perpetrator is often a member of the household with a personal motive. The most obvious suspect quickly became George Alidor when news of the murders first broke. George was captured on camera. George appeared devastated, desperately trying to push past officers to get inside the house. His frantic, broken demeanor looked like that of a grieving husband and father, but when it came time for questioning, his behavior took a sharp and unsettling turn. Instead of showing overwhelming sorrow or demanding justice for his wife and children, George remained eerily calm. He offered little reaction, simply stating, "It's in God's hands now. God will prevail. Jesus knows." To detectives, this passive acceptance was troubling. While George was known to be deeply religious, his lack of urgency and emotion did not align with what they expected from a grieving husband. Most would be consumed by grief, desperate for answers, and driven to find justice. George, however, seemed unfazed, barely engaging during questioning and offering no meaningful answers. After just a short time, he quietly left. Although George consistently denied any involvement in the murders, his strange behavior and the absence of other suspects only increased police suspicion. At one point, he agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results suggested deception still, because polygraphs are not reliable enough for court evidence. Investigators couldn't make an arrest based solely on those results. Soon after, George stopped cooperating. Altogether, he refused further interviews and withdrew from public life. Fueling belief that he was hiding something, he moved in with his sister and brother-in-law, avoided public appearances, ceased attending church, and took a leave of absence from work. Those close to him said he seemed aware that questions were common questions he didn't want to face. Meanwhile, detectives continued their exhaustive investigation. They ruled out robbery and drug-related motives, but George remained their primary suspect. A handwriting analysis was performed to compare George's writing with the threatening message left on the wall, but no match was found. Still, the feeling persisted that George was withholding critical information. Typically, someone who has lost their entire family in such a brutal way would stop at nothing to help police find the perpetrator. But George's uncooperative and detached behavior raised red flags from the outset. After a second police interview, he stopped speaking to detectives altogether. The case took an even stranger turn when investigators discovered a mysterious phone call made from the family's home at 7:09 a.m. on the morning of the murders. The call was placed to Marie's uncle in Washington, D.C., although he didn't answer. His wife did, but she wasn't sure who she spoke to initially, believing it was Marie. She later expressed doubt, saying the voice didn't sound familiar. This phone call raised serious questions. The timing was crucial. It occurred just 9 minutes after George was said to have left for work, where he reportedly arrived by 7:30 a.m. If Marie was still alive at the time of the call, it would be impossible for George to have committed the murders and made it to work on time. But if it wasn't Marie on the phone, then who was? Could this mean there was another suspect? Despite this baffling and unexplained call, the investigation hit a dead end. Detectives pursued every lead, questioned neighbors, retraced George's movements, and examined his background. But as weeks turned into months and months into years, the case grew cold. A reward of $155,000 was offered to encourage new tips, but with no breakthroughs, the reward was eventually withdrawn. Still, Marie's family refused to give up. They held vigils and memorials to keep their loved one's memory alive, reached out to true crime programs in hopes of fresh attention, and remained convinced that George knew more than he was revealing. We're not giving up, they said. The police haven't given up either. It's as if it happened yesterday, even after 25 years to this day. Law enforcement considers Marie's husband, George Alador, the only suspect, but the mystery remains unsolved. Authorities never had enough evidence to formally charge George, but today, I'm telling you, be prepared. The truth will come to light. Family members remain hopefully, and more than that, certain that the killer will be found. The police have done everything they can, they say, but we believe in God, who is good, almighty, and all-powerful. There is nothing God cannot solve, and we hold on to that conviction. Amen. As the years went by, George moved on with his life. A few years after the murders, he remarried and relocated to Oklahoma. His decision to remarry shocked Marie's family, but their grief turned to anger when they learned the identity of his new wife. It was a woman familiar to both George and Marie, and rumors spread that the night before the murders, George had been at her home ostensibly to fix an air conditioning unit, but whispers suggested they were having an affair. Though George has remained the only suspect, he has never been charged in connection with the brutal killings of his wife, daughters, and mother-in-law. It's almost unfathomable that someone capable of such cruelty, murdering for innocent people, including a 6-week-old baby, could still walk free among society. The crime scene was so horrific that many of the officers and detectives involved required counseling to process what they witnessed. For the victim's family, the pain never lessened, and the weight of their loss remains unbearably heavy. Justice may be slow, but it should never be silent. Cases like this remind us that families still wait for answers, and victims' voices still need to be heard. It is an honor to share the story of the Altador family, with the hope that someone out there holds the key to finally bring justice. Chris was often praised by Shannon as the best dad in the world, and her steady support. Her social media posts painted a picture of a happy family, beautiful children, a loving marriage, financial stability, and a promising future. By the summer of 2018, things seemed to be improving even more. Shannon was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. She had just returned from a successful business trip to Arizona, and the family had recently enjoyed a 6-week visit with Chris's parents in North Carolina. But beneath this seemingly perfect exterior, something dark was brewing. On August 13, 2018, everything would change forever. In the early hours of that day, Shannon was dropped off at home at 1:48 a.m. by her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson Nunaware. It would be the last time she'd see her alive. What unfolded in the following hours would reveal the grim truth behind the picture-perfect facade, and expose how one man's secrets and lies led to a tragedy that gripped the nation and left everyone asking, how could someone do this to their own family? That morning in Frederick, Colorado, began like any other, but by 9 a.m., alarm bells were ringing for Nicole. She had called and texted Shannon multiple times, with no response, completely unlike her friend, who was usually quick to reply. Shannon had a doctor's appointment that morning to check on her pregnancy, but when Nicole contacted the office, she learned Shannon hadn't shown up. What made this even more troubling was that Shannon had recently confided in friends about growing tensions in her marriage during their recent 6-week trip to North Carolina. Chris had been distant, refusing to touch or kiss her when Shannon tried to plan a romantic weekend to rekindle their relationship. He seemed cold and uninterested. The signs were subtle at first, but became more apparent as summer progressed. Chris, once attentive and loving, started changing, working out obsessively, buying new clothes, going out more often under the pretense of meeting work friends, and guarding his phone closely. Most telling was his reaction to Shannon's pregnancy. News instead of joy. He responded with a chilling coldness. Hunan poured her fears and confusion into texts to friends. He hasn't touched me all week, hasn't kissed me, hasn't talked to me except when I'm trying to figure out what's wrong. she wrote. "We've never had a problem like this before. No joke, this is totally out of left field." When Nicole couldn't reach Shannon that morning, she sensed something was seriously wrong. She drove to the Watts home with her son. Nicholas in tow. Shannon's car was still in the garage, and her shoes, always left by the door, were exactly where they should be, but her phone, usually glued to her hand because of her social media work, was missing. Nicole tried the doorbell and knocked, but the house was silent. She called Chris, who seemed surprisingly unconcerned, suggesting Shannon was probably busy with the girls. But Nicole knew better, especially since Shannon's essential medication was still in the car. Medication she never went anywhere without. The security system was armed, indicating no one had left through the front door since Shannon's return. Growing more worried, Nicole called the Frederick Police Department. Officer Scott Coonrod arrived around 1:45 p.m., with Chris arriving shortly after. What followed was captured on the officer's body camera. Chilling moment later examined by millions. Chris calmly entered the garage code and led the officer through the house. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The girls' beds were neatly made, toys organized, and nothing appeared disturbed, but some small details spoke volumes. Shannon's wedding ring lay on the bedside table, something she never removed. Her purse and keys were still inside. Most unsettling was her phone, found powered off between the couch cushions, highly unusual for a woman so connected online. Officer Coonrod questioned Chris about his family's whereabouts. His answers were vague and oddly detached. He suggested Shannon might have taken the girls to a friend's house, but couldn't explain why she'd leave without her car, phone, or medication. When asked about any problems in their marriage, Chris downplayed the tensions Shannon had confided to her friends just days before that evening. As news of the disappearance spread, friends and neighbors gathered at the Watts home. Among them was Nathan Ternastik, whose security camera overlooked the driveway. What his camera recorded in the early morning hours would later prove crucial. Around 5:15 a.m., it captured Chris backing his work truck up to the garage, something he had never done before, and loading something into the back as the community rallied to find the missing mother and daughters. Chris's behavior continued to raise suspicion, while others frantically organized search parties and put up missing person posters. He remained unnervingly calm the next day. August 14th, Chris agreed to a series of televised interviews that would later haunt him. Standing on his front porch, he addressed the cameras, making a chilling plea. "I want everybody back. I want everybody back here, and everybody safe yet." His body language told a different story. His arms were crossed defensively. His expressions lacked genuine emotion, and at times he even smiled inappropriately. Behavioral experts later noted that he spoke about his family in the past tense, a common sign that someone knows their loved ones are no longer alive. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered troubling details. Despite the family's picture-perfect social media presence, the Watts were drowning in debt, having filed for bankruptcy in 2015. With new financial pressures mounting, Chris's recent behavior changes, his physical transformation, obsessive tracking of his macronutrients, and newfound secrecy around his phone also drew attention. But the most damning revelation was yet to come. As the investigation deepened, police discovered Chris was having an affair with a co-worker named Nicole Kessinger. The relationship had started in June, just 2 months before the disappearance, and had quickly intensified while Shannon was away in North Carolina with the girls. Chris and Nicole's relationship became serious. He told Nicole he was separating from his wife, conveniently omitting that Shannon was pregnant with their third child. Text messages showed Chris was already planning a future with Nicole. In the days before the disappearance, looking at apartment listings and shopping for jewelry, all while Shannon desperately tried to salvage their marriage, buying relationship self-help books, and planning a romantic weekend away. The investigation took a dramatic turn on August 15th, when police brought Chris in for questioning for hours. He maintained that Shannon had simply taken the girls and left, but under mounting evidence, including security footage and phone data, contradicting his timeline, his story began to fall apart. Then, in a surprising move, Chris requested to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown in from North Carolina. What followed, captured on the interrogation room cameras, became one of the most chilling confessions in recent memory. After his conversation with his father, Chris returned with a new version of events, a confession entwined with an attempt to shift blame. He claimed that on the morning of August 13th, he and Shannon had an emotional talk about their relationship when he revealed his affair. Shannon became distraught. He then made the horrific claim that she harmed their daughters, and in a fit of rage, he took her life. Investigators, however, found his story inconsistent. Cell phone records, surveillance footage, and other evidence told a very different story of what truly happened in those early hours. As pressure mounted, Chris finally agreed to lead investigators to the missing family in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He revealed where Shannon and the girls could be found at the Anadarko oil field where he worked, about 45 minutes from their home mat, the site known as Survey 319. Investigators made a heartbreaking discovery. Shannon's body was buried in a shallow grave, while the girls had been placed separately in oil tanks. Chris had used his knowledge as an oil field operator to conceal his horrific crimes and locations. Difficult to access, the details that emerged about that morning were devastating. Chris had waited for Shannon to return from her business trip, fully aware of his sinister plan once she was home and asleep. He put that plan into motion, the medical examiner would later confirm. The medical examiner confirmed that Shannon and her unborn son, whom they had planned to name Nico, had died in their own bedroom. Even more horrifying was the fact that Bella and Celeste had been alive during the 45-minute drive to the oil field. 4-year-old Bella had even pleaded with her father, begging him to spare her life, but Chris, in an unimaginable act of cruelty, carried out his plan and ultimately took the lives of both his daughters. The investigation revealed that Chris had been planning the murders for some time in the days leading up to the tragedy. He had been texting his girlfriend about their future together when news of the discovery spread. The community that had been praying for the Watts family's safe return was shattered. Thousands gathered for candlelight vigils, leaving teddy bears, flowers, and heartfelt messages outside the Watts home. The case, which had gripped national attention, had ended in the worst possible way on November 6, 2018. Chris Watts appeared in court for his arraignment. The courtroom was filled with family members, media, and community members following the case in a surprising move. Chris accepted a plea deal by pleading guilty to 9 charges including first-degree murder. He avoided the death penalty. The charges included 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with deceased human bodies. The sentencing hearing on November 19th was deeply emotional. Shannon's father, Frank Rusek, delivered a powerful victim impact statement that moved many to tears. Life will never be the same without Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. They had all their lives ahead of them. They were taken by a heartless one, taken by an evil monster. The most gut-wrenching moment came when Shannon's mother, Sandra Rusek, spoke directly to Chris, through tears even. Chris's own parents struggled to understand what their son had done. His mother, Cindy Watts, told the media, outside court, "I don't know if we ever will. Our son is not the monster portrayed in the media. I love him, but I am devastated by what happened." Judge Marcelo Kopko did not hold back when delivering the sentence, describing the case as the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled among thousands. He sentenced Chris to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the other charges. But the story didn't end there. In February 2019, Chris agreed to a 5-hour prison interview where he revealed the full truth about that morning, contradicting his earlier claims. He admitted that he had planned the murders to start a new life with his girlfriend. The details he shared about his daughter's final moments were heartbreaking. 4-year-old Bella had entered the bedroom after he killed Shannon, asking, "What's wrong with mommy?" Chris then loaded his wife's body and his 2 living daughters into his truck and drove to the oil field to carry out the final horrific acts. The revelation devastated both families again. Shannon's brother, Frankie Rusek, expressed his anguish. On social media, "I've never been so angry, sad, and confused. My sister and nieces were the light of the world. The pain never goes away." The tragedy deeply impacted the Frederick, Colorado community. The Watts home, once a symbol of suburban success, became a haunting reminder of the horror. Neighbors reported people driving by at all hours, some leaving flowers and stuffed animals, others simply trying to comprehend how such a tragedy unfolded in their quiet town. The Watts case sparked widespread discussion about domestic violence and family dynamics. Despite a flawless social media image filled with vacation photos and loving messages, a dark reality had been hidden beneath. This contrast fueled important conversations about how social media can mask serious issues within families. Chris's girlfriend, Nicole Kessinger, was caught in the aftermath, although cleared of any involvement. She was forced to change her identity and relocate due to intense public scrutiny and harassment. In her only police interview, she expressed horror at Chris's actions, insisting she had no knowledge that he was still married or that she was pregnant. The case has since inspired numerous documentaries, books, and specials. Netflix's 2020 documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, renewed public interest by using Shannon's social media videos and texts to reconstruct the final days. Experts have noted Chris's behavior after the murders as a textbook example of red flags in domestic violence cases: inappropriate emotional responses, a swift attempt to sell the family home, and inconsistent stories, all pointed to guilt. These warning signs are now used by law enforcement and domestic violence prevention groups to identify similar cases. The case also influenced how police handle missing persons involving children. The swift action by Nicole Atkinson and the Frederick Police Department's quick response have been praised as a model for other departments, preserving crucial evidence today. Chris Watt serves multiple life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, having been transferred from Colorado for security reasons. Prison sources say he keeps photos of his family in his cell and claims to read the Bible daily, saying he has found religion behind bars. He receives letters regularly from women, a phenomenon psychologists note is common with notorious killers. Meanwhile, Shannon's family has worked tirelessly to honor her memory and advocate for domestic violence awareness. They established a foundation in honor of Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, dedicated to helping women and children escape abusive situations. Frank and Sandra have become outspoken advocates for victims and survivors alike. Frank and Sandra Rusek have become passionate advocates for victims' rights, speaking at numerous domestic violence awareness events every year. On August 13th, the Frederick, Colorado community holds a remembrance ceremony honoring Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico. The memorial garden dedicated to them stands not only as a tribute to their lives, but also as a powerful reminder of the urgent need to recognize and address domestic violence before it escalates into tragedy, a heartfelt effort to keep Shannon's memory alive. Her mother now manages her daughter's social media accounts. What once chronicled a family's daily life has transformed into a memorial that raises awareness about the hidden dangers of domestic abuse. The very platforms that once showcased a seemingly perfect family now serve as a cautionary tale. Messages continue to pour in from people around the world touched by the case, many sharing how the Watts tragedy helped them recognize warning signs in their own relationships or motivated them to reach out to friends and family who may be struggling. The Ruseks have channeled their grief into advocacy, working with lawmakers to strengthen protections for pregnant women and children facing domestic violence. Their efforts have sparked discussions about new legislation aimed at increasing penalties for crimes against pregnant women and expanding resources for prevention. Frank Rusek summed up their mission in a recent interview. "We lost so much in one morning, daughter, grandchildren, and a future we'll never see. But if sharing our story helps even one person recognize the signs and get help, then Shannon, Bella, Celeste, and Nico didn't die in vain. As we close this tragic chapter, it's important to remember that behind the headlines and social media posts were real lives: a mother who loved fiercely, two young girls with bright futures, and an unborn child who never took a breath. Their story is a stark reminder that domestic violence often hides behind smiling faces and curated images. It calls on us to look deeper, to check in on our loved ones, and to act when something feels wrong. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the impact of his crimes continues to ripple throughout society. Every time someone notices a warning sign, makes a welfare check, or finds the courage to leave an abusive situation, that is part of the legacy of Sean and Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts. Their heartbreaking story has become a catalyst for change, a wake-up call that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones closest to home at times. Big Ronnie's discipline towards Butch was harsh and unpredictable. One moment he would embrace his son, and the next, he would throw him across the room. Luisa's brother, Michael Baganti Jr., later testified during the DeFeo trial about a frightening incident he witnessed when Butch was just 2 years old. He recalled, "We were all sitting in the basement, watching TV, and the boy must have done something wrong. Suddenly, the father stood up and pushed him hard into the wall. The boy hit his head or shoulder as a child." Butch struggled with severe obesity, a condition that lasted into his late teens until he began abusing amphetamines. His school life suffered as he was frequently bullied by bigger kids who called him names like the Blob, Bucky Beaver, and Pork Chop. Butch was not an only child for long. On July 29, 1956, Louise gave birth to a daughter, Dawn Teresa DeFeo. This was followed by Allison Louise DeFeo on August 16, 1961, and Mark Gregory DeFeo on September 4, 1962. After Mark's birth, Louise left Big Ronnie for reasons that remain unclear in an attempt to win her back. Big Ronnie co-wrote a song titled "The Real Thing," which jazz legend Joe Williams recorded in 1963 for his album One Is a Lonesome Number on October 24, 1965. Big Ronnie and Louise welcomed a third son, John Matthew DeFeo. By then, the family had moved from their Brooklyn apartment to an upscale home on Long Island's South Shore, in the affluent community of Amityville. Many wondered how Big Ronnie, a car dealer's service manager, could afford such luxury. The answer was that his father-in-law, Michael Baganti, Sr., covered much of the expenses in the early 1970s. Big Ronnie commissioned life-sized portraits to immortalize his family. The paintings, which took over a year to complete and reportedly cost at least $50,000, hung in large gilded frames on the staircase wall between the first and second floors of the DeFeo home. By this time, Butch had become increasingly troublesome. Although the family owned an auto body shop where he was supposed to work, he spent more time drinking at bars. His growing addiction to drugs and alcohol fueled violent outbursts toward his family, including an incident where he pulled a gun on his father. Then, in the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, Butch snapped, completely armed with a rifle. He moved silently through the house, killing his family members one by one as they slept. Chillingly, the murders took place within just 15 minutes, and the victims showed no signs of struggle. Even stranger, despite the rifle lacking a silencer, no neighbors reported hearing gunshots. Only the family dog barked after the killings. Butch calmly took a bath, dressed for work, and reported the crime, claiming he had discovered the bodies upon returning home. He even suggested that a mafia hitman named Louis Fellini, along with 2 accomplices, was responsible. However, police soon found inconsistencies in his story. Fellini had an airtight alibi, being out of state at the time under pressure, Butch confessed, saying, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He described how he bathed, changed clothes, and disposed of evidence, including his blood-stained clothes and the Marlin rifle, before going to work, as if nothing had happened. It was rumored that Butch had been hearing voices urging him to commit the murders, but the prosecution's psychiatrists disagreed. Diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, Butch was found to have no hallucinations or possession, but simply no remorse or moral qualms about killing his family. He was convicted on 6 counts of murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, which he served at Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York, until his death on March 12, 2021. A lingering theory suggests a second killer might have been involved, but no other suspects were ever found, just over a year after the DeFeo family tragedy. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was sold to the Lutz family, who would soon unknowingly step into a new chapter of horror, with the home forever marked by its gruesome past. Many wonder whether the tragic events left behind a lingering, eerie presence, haunting the property. The Lutz family wouldn't have to wonder for long, as they soon experienced unsettling events that would become infamous and far from the typical haunting stories one might expect. Although the asking price was slightly above their initial budget of $30,000 to $50,000, something about the house captivated the Lutz family. The beautiful colonial-style home featured 6 bedrooms, a heated pool, and a boathouse right on the Amityville River. The Lutzes were well aware of the horrific murders that had taken place there, but despite its dark history, they fell in love with the property and believed it was meant to be theirs. They purchased the house for a bargain price of $80,000, never imagining the tragedy would make it unlivable. What was supposed to be their dream home soon turned into a nightmare. The strange and terrifying experiences that followed would later be shared with the world by author Jay Anson in his best-selling book, The Amityville Horror. Before moving in, George Lutz was a successful businessman, but shortly after settling in, a profound change came over him. He grew sluggish, distant, and irritable. Most unsettling of all, he began waking up every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., the precise time the DeFeo murders had occurred. One night, George was startled to see his 5-year-old daughter, Missy, standing by her bedroom window. What chilled him was the glowing outline of a pig's face with red eyes staring back from behind her. Rushing to her room, he found Missy sound asleep. As if nothing had happened. Soon after, Missy began talking about a new imaginary friend, a pig named Jody. But was Jody truly imaginary? On another haunting occasion, George looked at his wife Kathy while she slept and noticed her face had grotesquely aged overnight, appearing like that of a 90-year-old woman at times. Kathy seemed to undergo strange, rapid transformations, looking like someone else entirely. Even her mother witnessed these unnatural changes firsthand. The eerie occurrences only intensified. Doors were torn off their hinges, a room inexplicably filled with flies in the dead of winter, and cloven hoofprints mysteriously appeared in the snow near their doorstep. Inside the house, green slime oozed down the walls, and in the basement, the family discovered a hidden room that didn't appear on any original blueprints. The basement chamber was painted a disturbing shade of red, and only large enough to seat 2 people closely. An overpowering, rancid smell lingered there, contributing to the oppressive atmosphere of dread. George even tried to bring their family dog into the room, but the normally brave animal refused, retreating with tail between its legs and whimpering, a rare sign of terror that suggested the dog sensed an unseen presence. The strange happenings didn't end there. One night, George was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a band playing downstairs, as if an invisible party were taking place. When he hurried to investigate, the music abruptly stopped. The room was empty, but the rug had been rolled up and furniture shifted, as though a ghostly dance had just ended. Desperate for relief, the Lutz family called upon a priest to bless the house. However, when the priest entered, he was suddenly overcome with intense sickness and experienced his own disturbing phenomenon. Unspoken warning to stay away. Author Jay Anson, who later wrote The Amityville Horror, recalled that meeting the priest convinced him the story was real. Anson said, "This was actually happening to someone. This wasn't like The Exorcist or The Omen." It was this confirmation that inspired him to write the book. On January 14, 1976, after just 28 days, in what was meant to be their forever home. The Lutz family endured a night so terrifying they made a snap decision. They packed a few belongings, abandoned everything else, and fled, never to return according to a 2005 interview with George Lutz. Their departure was not planned. We didn't wake up that morning thinking we were leaving for good. This was our home when we left. We didn't know we wouldn't be coming back. We didn't know everything we left behind we would never see again. Their abandoned possessions, left frozen in time, were later put up for auction, as reported in a 1979 Washington Post article. The house that once seemed like what was meant to be a fresh start quickly became a place the Lutz family could never return to. Determined to share their harrowing ordeal, the Lutzes detailed every eerie encounter to writer J. Anson, who transformed their story into the best-selling 1977 book, The Amityville Horror. The book captivated readers nationwide, with the Los Angeles Times calling it both fascinating and terrifying. However, some critics argued that its appeal went beyond ghosts and haunted houses. They suggested the story struck a chord because of the unstable political and economic climate in America at the time. Widespread inflation, soaring interest rates, and an oil crisis had left the nation anxious and unsettled as the narrative unfolded. It became clear the Lutz family faced more than supernatural terrors. Their business was faltering amidst the struggling economy, and they were also under IRS investigation for their taxes. For many readers in the late 1970s, these real-life pressures felt all too familiar. Paranormal elements aside, the book's blend of supernatural horror and relatable financial struggles resonated deeply with the American public. Some critics also noted the story cleverly echoed popular horror tropes of the era, such as a loving father turning violent, as seen in The Shining, a reluctant priest battling dark forces reminiscent of The Exorcist, grotesque vomiting, and a coastal, small-town vibe that echoed Jaws. When asked about his own experience writing the book, Anson dismissed any claims of paranormal activity. "Leave it," he said. No, although, shortly after completing the manuscript, he suffered a heart attack, one he attributed to his smoking and unhealthy lifestyle rather than anything supernatural. Despite Anson's skepticism, strange incidents seemed to follow those connected to the story. Several people who handled early copies of the manuscript experienced near-fatal or fatal accidents. One friend's car caught fire while transporting the manuscript. Another and his son nearly drowned when their car plunged into water, but miraculously, the manuscript inside the trunk remained completely dry. The most chilling story involved a woman who received the first 2 chapters, only to die in a house fire that very night among the ashes. The pages of the manuscript were found untouched. The Lutz family's terrifying tale inspired several film adaptations, most famously the 1979 movie starring James Brolin. The story was revisited in 2005, with Ryan Reynolds portraying George Lutz. Both films remained true to the house's horrific backstory, the site of a gruesome family massacre, but took creative liberties to heighten the fear. For example, neither film included a babysitter character who did not appear in the original book. The 1979 version featured her watching the children while George and Kathy attended a wedding. The 2005 remake showed the couple out for the evening. Though the book stated the entire family attended the wedding together, the house itself was portrayed differently. Between films, the 1979 movie suggested the home itself was a malevolent force, influencing Ronald DeFeo Jr. to commit the murders in 1974. The 2005 remake shifted the terror to the ghosts of the victims, who became the primary source of haunting. The priest, who tried to help the Lutz family, also had varying fates, while the book describes him hearing a voice urging him to leave and eventually becoming ill. The films intensified his suffering, with attacks by swarms of supernatural flies and even blindness, though the 2005 remake took the greatest liberties. The 1979 film also altered key scenes, sometimes removing important context. Yet, through all versions, one grim fact remains: A family was brutally murdered in that house despite the Lutz's claims of paranormal experiences in 1975. No subsequent owners have reported hauntings. According to the Washington Post and real estate firm Coldwell Banker Harbor Light, several families have lived there since, and a previous owner even changed the address to avoid unwanted attention. The house last went on the market in summer 2016 and sold in February 2017 for just over $600,000, significantly less than the $950,000 it sold for in 2010. As for the actual murders, while Butch DeFeo died in his prison cell, many versions of the events and interviews with Butch continued to evolve before his death. In a 1986 interview, Butch claimed that his sister Dawn was the one who killed their father, and that their mother had murdered his siblings before he supposedly killed her in 1990. He filed a motion alleging that Dawn and an unknown assailant were the real perpetrators, and that he only shot Dawn accidentally during a struggle. Despite these shifting stories, his claims were met with widespread skepticism. In 2000, during an interview with author Rick Osuna, Butch asserted that his parents had conspired to kill him, which led him to ally with Dawn and others out of desperation. His narrative remained inconsistent, filled with contradictory details and unreliable witnesses. Some of his allegations even involved his wife, Geraldine Gates, further complicating the case. Though authorities and experts discredited many of these assertions, for those skeptical of paranormal explanations, it's easy to conclude that Butch was simply a troubled individual, haunted by childhood trauma and addiction, who saw no moral barrier in murdering his family. Yet, if the lingering spirits of the victims did haunt the Lutz family, one can only hope they ultimately found justice in peace. Story 6. A remote cabin, a brutal crime, and a mystery that has haunted investigators for over 40 years. What truly happened inside Cabin 28 in Keddie, California, on that fateful night in April 1981. Nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Keddie was a quiet, isolated town where people sought a fresh start. Towering pines lined the narrow roads, and rustic cabins stood clustered together like relics from a simpler era in the early 1980s. Keddie was little more than a former railroad town struggling to survive, small, secluded, and for the most part, peaceful. For 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, Keddie seemed the perfect place to rebuild her life. Recently separated from a troubled marriage, she sought a fresh start for herself and her 5 children. Though finances were tight, Sue was determined to provide a better future. They moved into Cabin 28, a modest rental at the Keddie Resort, where other struggling families also made their home. In the surface, the Sharps appeared to be a normal family. The children made friends. Sue worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and life in Keddie continued quietly. But on the night of April 11, 1981, everything changed. By morning, Cabin 28 had become a house of horror. 3 people were found brutally murdered inside. Blood smeared across floors and walls in a gruesome scene that shook even seasoned investigators. To make matters worse, 1 child was missing, vanished without a trace. What happened in Cabin 28 was more than just a crime. It was an act of savage terror that continues to haunt the small town to this day. There were subtle warnings, small, unsettling moments that hinted at a darker force looming. Sue had been receiving unwanted attention from certain men in town, particularly from Martin Smart, a local man with a violent history. Though his behavior made her uneasy, she tried to brush it off. Having faced worse before, fear wasn't something she allowed to control her. But the walls of Cabin 28 were about to witness horrors far worse than financial struggles or unwelcome advances. On the evening of April 11, 1981, the Sharp family carried on as usual, unaware their home would soon become the scene of one of the most brutal and baffling crimes in American history. At 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp, the eldest daughter, returned home after spending the night at a friend's house. She expected nothing out of the ordinary, perhaps even a chance for some extra rest, but as she pushed open the front door, she was confronted with a nightmare. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay sprawled on the living room floor, her lifeless body soaked in blood nearby. Her 15-year-old brother John had been killed. Just as brutally alongside him lay his best friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate, who was almost unrecognizable from the violence inflicted. The living room, once warm and full of life, had transformed into a grisly crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and pooled across the floor. Furniture was overturned. Evidence of a fierce struggle. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, while an oppressive silence suffocated the space. Frozen in shock, Sheila's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but was paralyzed by the horror. Her eyes scanned the room, struggling to make sense of the carnage. Before her, Sue Sharp's body was discovered near the couch, her hands bound tightly. With electrical and medical tape, she had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear, both secured firmly with tape. Her throat was nearly slit through, and deep stab wounds covered her chest and torso. A claw hammer had been used to bludgeon her face beyond recognition. John had suffered a similarly savage fate. Stab wounds and blunt force trauma marked his body, with signs that he had fought back fiercely. But against whom? Dana Wingate, an outsider to the family, had also been bound and brutally beaten. He had been strangled, likely with a cord, and his head had been smashed with such force that the weapon's imprint was clearly visible. Then Sheila noticed something even more disturbing. The back bedroom door creaked open. Inside, her younger brothers, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5, along with their friend Justin Smart, 12, were alive and unharmed, sound asleep and oblivious to the nightmare that had unfolded, just rooms away. Yet one person was missing: Tina Sharp, aged 12. She was nowhere to be found in the cabinet among the bodies, nor with the younger boys. The only evidence of her was an unsettling emptiness in the home, as if something or someone had been taken. Panic gripped Sheila as she fled to a neighbor's cabin, desperately seeking help. What followed was a small-town tragedy unfolding in real time. The sheriff's department was alerted. Neighbors gathered in shock, and within minutes, quiet Ketty was thrown into chaos when deputies from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office entered Cabin 28. They were immediately overwhelmed by the stench of blood. The dimly lit living room had been turned into a gruesome slaughterhouse. The bodies of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate lay lifeless, their hands bound with medical tape and electrical cords. The brutality was incomprehensibly was more than a crime scene. It was a message. Blood splattered not only the walls and floor, but even the ceiling. The intensity and duration of the attack suggested a sustained and vicious assault. One of the knives used was bent at a grotesque 90-degree angle. Clear evidence of the force behind the stabbing. It had given way before the assailant did. Sue's body lay on her side, hands tightly bound, blood soaked through her clothing, pooling ominously beneath her. She had been partially undressed, hinting at the possibility of a sexual element to the crime. Though no definitive evidence of assault was found, John and Dana lay side by side, their mutilated bodies nearly unrecognizable. Dana's skull was caved in, likely the result of repeated blows from the claw hammer. John's throat had been slashed so deeply that his windpipe was nearly severed. Yet, amidst all the horror, the most haunting mystery remained. Why had Tina Sharp vanished? Detectives quickly realized that the scene inside Cabin 28 defied all logic. The extreme violence, calculated precision, and sadistic overkill were unlike anything they had ever encountered. Then a chilling detail emerged. The bindings on the victims suggested the presence of multiple attackers. The knots varied. Some were expertly tied, others were sloppy and rushed, as if different individuals had restrained them at different times. Each with varying levels of skill. Forensic evidence painted a grim picture of the night's events. Blood spatter analysis indicated that John and Dana had been killed near the front door, their bodies later dragged to the spots where they were found. Sue, however, appeared to have been the primary target, enduring the most savage brutality. Adding to the grim details, investigators discovered an apparent attempt to muffle the sounds of the attack. A section of the cabin's walls had been stripped down to expose the insulation, possibly to absorb sound. Most chilling of all was a small piece of medical tape, similar to that used to bind Sue, found with bloodied fibers stuck to it. As if a gag had been ripped from someone's mouth. Mid-scream-over committed these horrific acts, did not act in blind fury. This was a calculated, methodical, and disturbingly ritualistic crime amidst the chaos of the crime scene. One fact stood out. Tina Sharp was missing. Her small bed in the back room was untouched, her belongings undisturbed, unlike her brothers, who had been left alive in the house. Tina had been taken, but why? The timeline grew even more twisted when neighbors reported hearing muffled screams. Around 1:30 a.m., no one called the police. Was it fear? Indifference? Or had the killers ensured no one would intervene? In the days that followed, search efforts focused on finding Tina. Helicopters scanned the forests. Volunteers combed nearby roads, creeks, and abandoned train cars. Police even considered the possibility of a ransom demand, but none ever arrived. Tina had disappeared without a trace. Forensic evidence suggested she had been alive when she left the cabin, but for how long? And what had her abductors intended? Weeks turned to months, then years, until finally in 1984, investigators received a devastating call. A skull fragment and a decayed blouse had been found 100 miles away in the Feather Falls area. Dental records confirmed the worst. It was Tina. Her remains had been exposed to the elements, discarded like an afterthought. Near where Tina's bones were discovered, a small strip of medical tape identical to the type used to bind Sue Sharp was found buried in the dirt. This suggested Tina had been kept alive for an unknown period after the murders, only to be disposed of when she was no longer needed. But what was she needed for? Despite the gruesome nature of the crime, the town of Keddie remained tight-lipped. Witness statements were inconsistent. Leads evaporated, and possible suspects either avoided questioning or provided alibis that seemed too convenient. Rumors swirled about local involvement, people who had lived in Keddie before and after the killings, blending quietly into the small-town fabric. The two primary suspects were Martin Smart, stepfather to Justin, and his friend Bo Bood, both reportedly at the local bar the night of the murders. Martin had a history of domestic violence, and just days after the crime, his wife filed for divorce, citing fear for her life. More chillingly, he allegedly told his therapist he had killed Sue Sharp. Still, no arrest was ever made. Then there was the mysterious anonymous call in 1984 when Tina's remains were discovered. A caller tipped off police about the location before the news was public. How did they know? And why was no follow-up ever made? The case languished. An open wound in Keddie. Evidence was misplaced, records lost, and key witnesses faded away for decades. It seemed the truth of what happened inside Cabin 28 might be lost forever among the grim artifacts of the Keddie murders. Two objects stood out: a claw hammer and a steak knife bent nearly at a 90-degree angle. They were more than just weapons. They symbolized the sheer brutality inflicted on the victims. But one of these weapons vanished for decades. Investigators noted that a claw hammer had been used to bludgeon the victims. However, a distinctive blue-handled hammer known to belong to Martin Smart was missing. Strangely, Martin told police his hammer had been stolen before the killings. This odd detail gained significance only years later. A breakthrough night, we revisit a chilling 35-year-old murder mystery. Investigators believe they may have uncovered one of the weapons used in the infamous Keddie cabin murders. CBS 13's Tony Lopez reports on this dramatic development in a case that has haunted the community for decades. In 2016, more than 3 decades after the horrific crime, a man scavenging in a dried-up pond just a few miles from Cabin 28 stumbled upon a rusted hammer. It matched the make and model of the distinctive hammer that had gone missing from the original. Crime scene authorities suspected it was deliberately discarded to conceal evidence. But after so many years, any traces of blood or DNA had long since vanished. Another unsettling detail was the steak knife found at the scene bent, almost at a right angle from the force used. This suggested one of two possibilities. Either the killer stabbed with uncontrollable rage, exerting far more force than necessary, or the victim fought back fiercely, bending the blade in the struggle. Either way, this was not the act of someone seeking a quick kill. It was personal, sadistic, and drawn out, adding to the mystery. Investigators believe a second knife, possibly an even deadlier weapon, was never recovered. Some speculate the killer took it as a trophy or to further eliminate evidence as the investigation pieced together the grisly crime scene. One question loomed: who could commit such a brutal act? There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was stolen, ruling out a random burglary or robbery gone wrong. The excessive violence and overkill suggested deep-seated rage. The perpetrator wanted the victims to suffer, but why? And why was Tina Sharp taken? In the following weeks, authorities interviewed locals, neighbors, and family members in search of anyone with a motive. The focus quickly narrowed to two men. Marty Smart, and John Bode. Marty Smart lived just a few cabins from the Sharps and was notorious for his violent temper. He had a history of abusing his wife, Marilyn, and often clashed with Sue Sharp, who had been counseling Marilyn to leave Marty. Marilyn later revealed that Marty hated Sue, calling her a underscore, and blaming her for interfering in his marriage on the night of the murders. Marty and his friend Bode had been at the local bar, Marilyn claimed. Marty returned home exhibiting strange behavior and burned a pair of blood-stained shoes in their fireplace. Even more chilling, Marty allegedly confessed to his therapist that he had killed Sue Sharp, though he denied involvement with the children. Despite this disturbing admission, law enforcement took no immediate action. John Bode was a former Chicago mobster with a shady background who had recently arrived in Ketty. He lived with Marty and was known to provoke Marty. When he was angry, Bode had no clear connection to the Sharp family, making his role less obvious, but his criminal history and close ties to Marty made him a suspect. However, no solid evidence ever linked Bode to the crime, and he eventually disappeared from town. Despite these promising leads, the investigation quickly unraveled. Crucial evidence vanished. Mysteriously, Marty's confession tape was lost. Crime scene photos disappeared from police files, and no fingerprints or DNA were ever conclusively matched to a suspect. Locals suspected a cover-up. Rumors circulated that Marty Smart had ties to law enforcement, potentially explaining why he was never charged. Despite his confession years later, new investigators reopened the case and found key witness statements had been overlooked. Some speculated Tina Sharp might have been taken alive for human trafficking or ritualistic purposes, but nothing was confirmed. No one was ever convicted for the Ketty murders. Marty Smart died in 2006, taking his secrets with him. Bode passed away in 1988 without ever standing trial. The case remains officially unsolved, though new evidence occasionally surfaces. The discovery of the hammer in 2016 renewed hope, but many believe corruption and incompetence allowed the killers to evade justice. Even now, the Ketty murders stand as one of America's most haunting unsolved crimes as the rain gently falls and the night deepens. Thank you for joining me here at Crime Whispers. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying vigilant, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep until we meet again. Stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you. Though the Ketty murders remain unresolved, the echoes of that night still linger in the minds of those who lived through it. For the families of the victims, the pain never truly fades, and the questions continue to haunt them decades later. Cases like this remind us how fragile the line between safety and horror can be, and how sometimes justice is harder to catch than the truth itself. While new technology and investigative methods bring hope for answers, some mysteries remain buried beneath layers of time, fear, and silence. If there's one thing the Ketty murders teach us, it's to never forget the victims and to keep searching for the light, even in the darkest places. Thank you for listening tonight on Crime Whispers. If you've been moved by this story, please consider sharing it, because sometimes the truth needs more voices to be heard. Until next time, take care of yourself and your loved ones. And remember, the shadows may be long, but there is always hope beyond the night. Good night.